Howdy folks, Treadhead Pete here. So it's June 6th, D-Day. And for my Operation Overlord video this year, I have for you the first of a new series of videos that I'm going to call a Veterans Profile. And for those of you who don't know, I work in a veterans care program in a hospital in Canada. And most of my interactions with the patients I serve are protected by medical privacy legislation. So I have to be careful about what I say. But what I can do is use publicly available information about their life and their military service, and hopefully provide some context through the conversations I've had with these men and women. So that brings us to this smiling young fella. This is Melbourne Hugh Neily, and he was born September 14th, 1922 in Spa Springs, Nova Scotia. Now, I knew him as Hugh. In fact, everybody his whole life knew him as Hugh. As the story goes, his mother Evelyn said, "There's only room in the house for one Melbourne," and that would have been his father, Captain Melbourne Parker Neily, a First World War veteran. His parents met in England while Melbourne was stationed there with the Canadian Army during the First World War. And after the war, they moved to Nova Scotia in Canada and bought a farm. So Hugh grew up on a farm. And one of the things he did, starting as a young lad, was raise chickens to provide money for himself and the family. And apparently, he said, until he could afford a brooder and incubator, that sort of thing, he used to keep the chickens in an overturned wash tub with a light bulb to keep them warm. Eventually, the Second World War came along, and Hugh volunteered for the Canadian Army and started out in the medical corps. He trained as a medic. When they found out he could type, they put him in the office, and soon enough he rose to the rank of sergeant and was in charge of the office of the field hospital at the assembly camp in Aldershot, Nova Scotia. Now, the number of personnel at that camp quickly rose to 35,000, so he was busy at the hospital, and one of his primary jobs there was helping to collect and edit the medical histories of all the patients that went through the hospital. After performing well on an aptitude test, he was sent to officer training in Trois-Rivières, Quebec. And he was commissioned as an officer. And one of the first jobs he had as an officer was escorting newly enlisted personnel from Nova Scotia to Montreal, Quebec, where they would have boarded ships to take them overseas and join the fighting. Now, eventually, they had a big meeting, and the colonel in command of his unit said that they were looking for officers for the CANLOAN program. Now, the CANLOAN program came about because the British Army was desperately short of officers, and Canada had an excess. So the Brits were looking for volunteers from Commonwealth countries, and so after some deliberation, Hugh volunteered for the program, and after 17 days on board ship, crossing the Atlantic in a convoy, they arrived in Edinburgh, Scotland, where he was promptly assigned to the 3rd British Infantry Division, 8th Brigade, specifically A Company, 2nd Battalion of the East Yorkshire Regiment. So here we have the cap badge of the East Yorkshires, where Hugh was assigned as a platoon commander. Now, the East Yorkshires, as part of the 8th Brigade, the 8th was the assault brigade on D-Day. So here we have a young Canadian lieutenant with no combat experience landing with his platoon with the first wave at Sword Beach on D-Day. So this picture is Sword Beach. You can see some duplex drive Shermans on the beach, and troops exiting landing craft. This shows you the location of Sword Beach. It's the easternmost beach, with Juno, the Canadian beach, immediately to the west. And past that, on the left of the screen there, is Gold Beach, the other British beach. Hugh and his platoon made it ashore, losing one man on the way in, struck and killed instantly. But they were able to get off the beach and make it through the initial barricades and defenses, taking several prisoners along the way. The platoon was reformed on the other side, and they found themselves with a large field to cross. Hugh's platoon was to act as the rear guard. The first two platoons made it across without incident, but when Hugh and his men were halfway across, they were struck by 3 rounds in succession from either German artillery or mortars, and Hugh was knocked unconscious. When he came to, he had a shrapnel wound in his left leg and couldn't move it. Using his rifle as a crutch and his medical training, he was able to patch up his men, and he stayed with them and moved them towards the rear area in safety until they found a truck to get them to an aid station. Hugh quickly recovered from his shrapnel wound in France, and approximately 2 weeks later, while assaulting a German position, he took a bullet through the right shoulder and was taken prisoner along with a number of his men. The Germans sent him back towards the rear area of their lines through a grain field, but they failed to assign an escort, so as soon as they were out of sight, they ducked into the bushes and were able to make their way back to Allied lines. Hugh was in a tent hospital in France for less than a day until it was shelled by German artillery, so he was moved to a hospital in Plymouth, England. When they realized he was Canadian, he was transferred to a Canadian hospital in Britain, where he recovered from his wounds. In November of 1944, having recovered from wounds suffered in France, Hugh received his second CANLOAN posting with this regiment here, the 1st Battalion of the Sherwood Foresters. Sherwood Foresters were part of a division training to go to Burma to fight the Japanese. However, several weeks into the training, Hugh and approximately 150 other men were told they had been selected for the Prime Minister's Guard. Turns out this is what they were supposed to guard. This is Chequers, the British Prime Minister's official country house. It's sort of like a retreat for the British PM. Anyway, Hugh remained here on this posting for the rest of the war, and he said it was a really soft job. Well, Hugh, after having been shot and blown up in the space of a couple of weeks, I don't think there are many who would begrudge you the easy job. While recovering in hospital from the wounds in France, Hugh met his future wife. This is Ruth Stiles. She was a Canadian nursing sister serving with the Canadian hospital in Britain, and they were married in March of 1945. They had 4 children: Barbara, twins Bob and Patricia, and Bill. After the war, Hugh farmed in Nova Scotia for a couple of years, but Ruth didn't like Nova Scotia much. She wanted to move closer to her family in Ontario. Hugh tried to buy a farm in Ontario, but was unable to do so, land being pretty scarce at the time. So instead, he took a job with Snap-on Tools, first operating a distributorship in Niagara Falls and southern Ontario, and then moving out to Calgary, Alberta, and finally out west. He also worked in Regina, Saskatchewan. Hugh and the family moved to London, Ontario, where Hugh founded his own mechanical equipment company called Nevtro Pumps and Mechanical. Nevtro continues to operate in London to this day. Hugh and Ruth retired in London. They loved to travel. They spent many winters in Florida. They made cruises to the Caribbean, the Panama Canal, the Mediterranean, and Greece. And Hugh and Ruth also made 3 trips to China. Ruth's uncle was Dr. Norman Bethune, and Hugh and Ruth continued the medical charity work that he had started in China in the 1930s. After 64 years of marriage, Ruth passed away in 2007, and Hugh passed away in April 30th, 2022. A remarkable man with a remarkable story. This is the CANLOAN Memorial. Of the 673 officers like Hugh that volunteered for service with the British Army, 128 of them gave their lives. And their names are inscribed on this memorial. And if you'd like to visit, it's in Canada's capital city of Ottawa, in Stanley Park on the shores of the Ottawa River. Anyway, it's a fascinating story. I want to thank you for coming out. Leave some comments down below. Tell me what you think. And once again, thanks for coming out, and we'll see you next time. Bye now.